Hello, I'm Harry Riley. Welcome to Harry's 10-Minute Tales. This is called Best Pals by Harry Riley. Brian and Arthur were cousins and best pals. Both decided to join the army. Then, much later, many miles apart, and over the same weekend, both became involved in life-threatening situations. This is fiction, and resemblance to anyone, living or dead, is coincidental. We sat drinking in our local pub when Arthur made his shock announcement. It was the late 1950s, and my best pal had decided to join the army. He put down his glass. "Are you coming with me, Brian?" I replied that I'd love to, but I still had 2 years of an apprenticeship to serve, and so I was stuck. There was nothing more I could say. He had volunteered for the REME, Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, and when he returned home on leave, he was full of the excitement and adventure of it all. He would reminisce over a pint at the trip to Jerusalem about the great comradeship and talk about foreign travel after completion of basic training. He already knew he was going to Christmas Island. I listened eagerly, but couldn't get away to join in the fun, so I decided to do the next best thing and become a part-time soldier. My plan was to join the Royal Artillery, my dad's old regiment. There was a small regimental barracks within 3 miles from my home, so I made an appointment and duly joined up for 2 years in the Territorial Army. I had signed up for foreign service duty, and if called upon, fully expected to do summer training abroad. There was talk we could be sent to Germany, but it never came off. It was now the Cold War, with Russia's nuclear threat ever present, to vaporise us all. In the meantime, Arthur sent back photos of himself lounging in Hawaii, stripped to the waist and looking every inch the suntanned soldier. This was amazing because he was a redhead like me, and previously only ever went lobster red and pale. At least I was now getting involved in soldiering of a sort, and ought to have been grateful, but my uniform was thick and incredibly itchy, and the only chance I got for rifle practice was at the annual butts, when we each had to fire old wartime 303 bolt-action rifles in order to qualify for the bounty payout. Having a keen interest in motorbikes, I had tried to become a dispatch rider, but demand was high, and so I chose to be a driver and wireless operator instead. Along with several others in our battery, I would take my turn to crash the gears of a big truck as the instructor tried vainly to teach us to double declutch up steep hills. It was all good fun, but when I eventually became my sergeant major's driver operator, he would only allow me to drive around the camp perimeter at 5 miles an hour, being doubtful of my ability to brake in an emergency. Our regiment was equipped with 25-pounder field guns, and a gun and ammunition limber would be ordered along behind a big truck to army firing ranges for weekend training. I soon made friends with a couple of lads who were not particularly educated or articulate, but were full of fun and always playing pranks. They were part of a field gun firing team, one being a gun layer and the other being a loader. I would sit at my wireless set in the back of a jeep, watching the guns from a safe distance as the 4-man team swung into action. My 2 poles would swiftly complete their tasks and then kneel upright at attention with stiff ramrod backs waiting for the signal to fire. My first close-up experience of a 25-pounder shell being fired was never to be forgotten. There was a colossal bang and a sheet of flame leapt from the end of the barrel, and then the whole sky was filled with a mighty thunderous roar that threatened to split my eardrums as the shell passed overhead towards the distant target. I was scared witless, and yet my 2 poles, right at the seat of the action, never flinched. They were like stone statues, until they swung into action again to set up for the next round. How they could stand this deafening roar never failed to amaze me. I swelled with pride to know such staunch warriors. These were the kind, I thought, who had helped to beat the enemy in the last war. On another occasion I drove my officer to the observation post and sat in the hut along with the officers as a senior wireless operator sent down coordinates to the gun crew commander. With his crew he would then lay the gun to these instructions, and shortly afterwards, if correct, we would see an old tank explode. This was riveting stuff, until the third round, when we had a premature shellburst. One of the live rounds almost landed on top of us, the deep crater being only yards from our hut. We had had a lucky escape. It was a grim coincidence that as I returned home, hot and exhausted after the weekend of training, that the sad faces told me something traumatic had happened. Arthur, my best pal, was dead. He was only 2 years older than me, and had survived the H-bomb tests in the Pacific, and had then been posted to Germany. Being a heavy smoker, it was thought that instead of sleeping in the tents, he had chosen to spend the night in a truck, loaded with tyres whilst on manoeuvres. But in the night the truck caught fire, and his remains were not discovered until the following morning. They said he must have fallen asleep in the back of the wagon while smoking. My mind went back to that night at the pub, when he'd come home on leave. We'd grown to get up together as brothers, but he'd had a disrupted childhood, after his mother died when he was only 10. From then on he'd been shunted about with relatives. At work he'd had a succession of jobs, but then at the pub, eyes alight and proudly wearing his new uniform, he'd confided to me that when he'd finally finished with the army, he would have a proper trade to come back to. He would be a fully qualified heavy recovery mechanic and could get a job in a garage or even start his own business. It seemed so unfair, and his untimely death still rankles after all these years. I often think, why him and not me? End.